All right, what's going on, everybody? So this is going to be part 3 of chapter 9. For some of you, I got into this a little bit, so you could fast forward to where we left off. And for some of you, I didn't cover this at all. But just as a quick reminder, chapter 9 is all about kind of the economic transformations that were taking place in the first half of the 1800s. It's part of this unit 4, called Overlapping Revolutions, that takes us from 1800 to 1860. So basically, the Revolution of 1800, as Jefferson called it, to Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. This time period is also known as the antebellum period in American history. Antebellum, which means before the war, because the Civil War is going to start in 1861. So this time period is an interesting time period because it's just all about us growing up as a country. This is our childhood, right? It's called Overlapping Revolutions. It's all these transformations. We are changing in these huge, significant ways. Politically, socially, culturally, economically. And so chapter 9 focuses on the economic, right? And so we've already talked about a lot of these economic changes that were happening during this time period. We talked about the Industrial Revolution, the Market Revolution, the Transportation Revolution. All of those revolutions basically kind of are one big economic transformation. They all kind of are intertwined with one another, kind of a little bit of a feedback loop between the three. And so it all starts with kind of the government deciding that we want to create economic connections that keep our country bound together, because we have this growing, emerging kind of Western region, right? We've talked about the North and the South a lot. Now we have this West, the other side of the Appalachians. And the only way to really make that area economically viable is to make sure that people can transport whatever they're growing or whatever they're making out there in the West, be able to transport that to the East. So the government decides that they need to invest a ton of money in roads, canals, and railroads that will connect the West. And when we say the West, we're talking about kind of like the Great Lakes region, not like what we think of the West today, but like Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, some other states around there, Kentucky. We have to connect. We have to create a transportation connection, or else no one's going to want to move out there or grow anything, because they're not going to be able to kind of export any of their stuff. So this transportation revolution happens as a result of government action, which fits right in line with the Hamiltonian way of thinking. Even though Alexander Hamilton is dead and gone, Hamiltonianism is still alive and well. So that the government should be playing, this is the Hamilton ideology, the government should be playing an active role in promoting a manufacturing economy or promoting the economy in general. So it's kind of this idea that when he created his financial plan, he was all about protective tariffs to make sure that foreign goods are kept out, and the Bank of the United States giving out a whole bunch of loans to people who wanted to start businesses, and that kind of began our manufacturing sector. Now, with the same logic, with the same mentality, we're building roads, we're building canals, we're building railroads in order to be able to connect east to west. So this is what's the transportation revolution. The transportation revolution is going to feed the market revolution and the industrial revolution, which we talked about before already, with the market revolution kind of transforming American society from being an economy in which people really kind of stayed within their little tight circles, didn't travel very far, their entire economic lives existed within a small area. Now, because most people are working and engaging in an economy that is going through this market revolution, they are connected to people hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away. Basically, we have 3 different regions that specialize in 3 different things. The North is becoming increasingly an industrial area, an industrial region, which brings in the Industrial Revolution to our conversation. They're the ones that make stuff in factories. The West is where our food comes from. They got livestock, and they got grains and wheat and barley and all that other stuff. And the South has always been tobacco and rice. More and more now it's cotton. So the economic connection between these 3 regions is going to bind them together, and it's only going to be able to happen because of investments in transportation that the government is going to do. So now, in essence, if you think back to when America was the colonies, and there's a lot of import-export going on because we were the colonies of Great Britain, right? So we were exporting a lot of stuff to them, importing a lot of stuff from them. Similar concept here, but it's just within the United States, imports and exports between these different regions. So if you are anyone that is in the United States during this time period, a growing number of people are becoming, again, part of this economic system that connects people over hundreds, if not thousands of miles, rather than being in this little kind of like 20 or 30 mile, distance that they would travel in their entire lives. So that's kind of what we talked about in the first couple of parts to this chapter. Like part one was really all about industrialization happening in the Northeast. Part two was really kind of expanding it out to this market revolution, how it's impacting the United States. And now part three is going to focus back in on the Northeast and how kind of their society is being impacted by industrialization. So part three, the new social classes and cultures. We've talked quite a bit about in the past about how the South had a much more kind of rigid class system than the North did. Like the South had pretty solid classes. You had your planter class at the top, who were a very small group of very wealthy and powerful men who controlled pretty much everything. They owned all the slaves, owned all the land, owned all the crops, controlled the government, controlled the economy, controlled society. A very small group of men at the very top. Right, that's the planter class in the South. And then below them, you have another class of people that own some land and own some slaves and are doing pretty well for themselves, but don't like dominate, culture and everything in the way that the planter class does. Then below them, you have this very large group of white guys who don't own any land, who are poor mostly, and work for, one of those upper classes. Then below that, of course, in the South, you have a whole class of slaves. And it's a very rigid system. The gaps between each class are significant, right? And that's just the way it's been. Up until the Industrial Revolution, the North hasn't really been like that. The Northeast has been, sure, they've had rich and middle class and poor, obviously, but the space between the classes was not that great. It wasn't as much of a visible part of their society. Everybody kind of lived in close proximity to one another just because it was a more kind of like urban, dense area. Because of that Puritan culture, there was a stronger sense of people taking care of one another. So there wasn't kind of this like, yes, I'm rich and you're middle class and you're poor, but there's these big, huge gaps that kind of defined who you were. However, and this is kind of the big takeaway of part three, as industrialization explodes in the Northeast, a more rigid class structure will emerge. That's going to mirror in many ways what the one in the South has been like for a long time, right? So once again, as industrialization explodes in the Northeast, a more rigid class system will emerge. So this slide right here kind of shows you what we're looking at. So at the very top, you have the wealthy business elite, kind of like the planter class. These guys own everything. They own the factories, they own the banks, they own the boats, they own the docks and the ports and all the stuff. They own it all. And they control all aspects of society. They're the ones that serve in government. They're the ones that control all of the, decisions about what's going on with the economy. Much like the planter class in the South, this wealthy business elite is the pinnacle and kind of the center of society in the North because they control pretty much everything. And it's a very small group of very wealthy men. Below them, you have a middle class. So if you think about it like this, going back to the wealthy business elite, if you say they're the ones who own all of the stuff, the middle class are the people who run or manage all of the stuff. So these are usually people who are college educated, people who are doing pretty well, probably own their home, et cetera, and they're hired by the wealthy business elite to manage the factory or to manage the imports, exports of the docks or to manage, be a banker, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a larger class of people in the wealthy business elite. And they're doing pretty okay for themselves, but they're not like super wealthy, right? Then below the middle class, you have this incredibly large class of people that is growing more and more and more every day as we industrialize, which is propertyless wage earners. They don't own land. They don't own, a little workshop. This is what we talked about in part one. We see all these people who owned their home and owned their land and owned a little workshop, and that's going away. And more people are forced to kind of migrate into this urban area and go work for somebody else where they don't own or control anything. So that is the largest class of people in the North, and it is growing more by the day. Propertyless wage earners. So again, if you want to compare it to the South, just like the wealthy business elite and the planter class are very comparable. In the South, most white people in the South don't own any land, don't own any slaves, and work for the wealthy white people. In the North, most white people in the North are getting to a point where they don't own any land, they don't own a factory, and they work for wealthy white people. They live in cities rather than in rural areas, and they do jobs like factory work and other things like that. So it's different, but it's very similar in kind of their class and society. So this is emerging as a very strict class structure that we see here. As a result of industrialization. All right, so let's take a look at each one of these classes pretty quickly. So you have the wealthy business elite. Like these are the guys who own the stuff. These are the guys at the top of the whole thing. Merchants, manufacturers, bankers, landlords. They own the factories, own the boats, own the docks, own the banks, own all that stuff, incredibly wealthy. By 1860, the richest 10% of the nation's families, 10% of the nation's families own 70% of the nation's wealth. That is a monumental amount of income inequality, right? The rich own a lot, leaving not very much left over for everybody else. And that's something that, if you pay a little bit of attention to what's going on, it's something that should sound familiar because it's very similar to what our society is today. We have monumental income inequality today, but they had it back then as well, right on the doorstep of the Civil War, right, which starts in 1861. You see this huge income inequality emerging in the industrial area. But the wealthy business elite are the ones who are at the top, who own everything. They are happy. They're good to go. The middle class is, like I said, people who are people generally are college educated, people who are hired by the wealthy business elite to basically like run the stuff. So it's like, I don't own the factory, but I manage the factory. I don't own the docks, but I control the imports, exports. I don't own the bank, but I am the guy that like manages the bank, right? So again, people who are college educated, who are hired, paid pretty well, probably own their home, et cetera, et cetera. This makes up about 40% of the population of the Northeast in 1840. So the wealthy business elite is a small group. The middle class is about 40%, and we'll get to this more on the next slide, but that tells you that a majority, more than 50%, a majority of the people living in the North are part of that poor working class. So a couple of aspects of the kind of culture that's emerging around the middle class during this time period. You can see things changing from the way society used to be. First is this kind of like obsession with things, right? Like what we would now today call consumerism, which will emerge in like the 1890s. So we're not quite there yet, but it's a very similar concept where it's like the way to identify yourself and to set yourself apart from others is to have more stuff than them, and not just have more stuff, but have nicer stuff, right? So whatever that would be in the 1840s, I don't know. But if you looked at today's society, we all know there's like, whether we like it or not, whether we want to do it or not, there's like this implicit judgment we make about people who, if you have a nicer car, if you have the newer iPhone, if you dress in nicer clothes, if you have the newest shoes, like if your home has 5-bedroom versus 3 bedrooms, there's these kind of implicit assumptions and judgments we make about people one way or the other, depending on what they have. And that's built into us because we live in a very consumeristic society. We're not going to call it consumerism in the 1840s, but that kind of idea is beginning to emerge even within the middle class. Like people kind of like, well, we got to keep up with the Joneses. The people down the street got the newest Widgemoo. We got to get the newest Widgemoo, or an even newer Widgemoo, or a bigger, or a shinier Widgemoo, whatever it is. So that idea of like having stuff and that differentiating you from people who are below you in society, is emerging as a middle class thought process. But an even bigger one, which again, I would argue is still very much with us today, is this idea that if you are rich, it must be because you did something right. You worked really hard, you're really smart, there's something special about you have a special set of skills that maybe you were born with, whatever it is. If you are rich, it's because you are special, right? Okay, but the converse of that often comes with it. If you are poor, it must be because you are lazy, or you are stupid, or you refuse to work hard, or there is something about you that is not special or broken in some way or whatever, right? It kind of becomes baked into our society. And again, I would argue, you could disagree if you'd like, that it's still very much with us today, that we have these built-in assumptions that, so if you look at, okay, here's look at this guy right here is poor. Why is he poor, right? And there's really two answers. Either one, because there's something wrong with him and he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's not smart enough, or he doesn't work hard enough, or whatever. And the other answer is, well, maybe there's something wrong with the system in general. Like maybe there's something wrong with our economic system, our society, that doesn't give opportunities to poor people to get out of poverty, right? And so that's kind of a conversation that happens across American history. Right now, most people are kind of citing on it's probably your fault that you're poor, right? So there's kind of this implicit judgment that comes with people who are poor during this time period, right? So speaking about people who are poor, part of the working class, poor urban workers are the working class, right? So these are the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, that big growing group of people. And I say growing because everybody's moving out of their cottages, and like we talked about before, like you have to abandon your little workshop and come work in the factories because that's the way the economy is going. So the number of people who are coming to work in the factories, work for somebody else, be told what to do by somebody else, that we alluded to earlier in the lecture, this idea that you're losing some sense of autonomy, you're losing some sense of like the Republican ideals of America at that time, which is that every man should kind of control his own destiny to a certain degree. That's being lost, at least economically, as more and more people are going to work in factories, right? So these are the people who are at that position, right? You probably don't have a college education or really any formal education beyond public school, which at that point was basically just like elementary, learn how to read and write and then get the hell out of here. And these are people who are manual laborers, right? They wash clothes and they carry lumber and bricks and they load and unload ships, and they're the ones that are digging the canals and building the roads and building the railroads, and they're carpenters and they're seamstresses and they're laborers in the factories. This image on the bottom left hand of the screen is a pretty does a pretty good job of capturing kind of the scenes that you would find in a lot of these kind of industrial cities, right? We talked earlier in the lecture about how there's this growth of industrial cities. Well, most of the people who live in those industrial cities, who work in these factories, don't get paid good wages and are in pretty bad economic shape. And so this kind of group of children who obviously are wearing ratty clothes, just sleeping on the streets, whatever, which is a pretty sad portrayal, is a somewhat common, scene that you would see in the industrial cities during this time period. A couple of quotes that really highlight kind of this segment of society, right? So this dude, the quote from this guy right here, he was a paymaster at the Hamilton Manufacturing Company. So he's one of those middle class guys, right? A guy with an education who kind of runs the factory, whatever, that kind of stuff. And here's a quote from him. He said, "In large manufacturing towns, many more must fill subordinate stations and must be under the immediate direction and control of a master or superintendent, compared to the farming towns." So this is exactly what we were talking about in part one. More and more and more Americans find themselves in a position where they are subordinate. They are under immediate control of a master, a superintendent. So again, people are having this great sense of losing a sense of autonomy and control. By the way, the guy who said that, as you can see, his name is Ithamar Beard. Ithamar Beard. That's an amazing name. We don't have names like that anymore. 1800s, so many great names that they had back in the 1800s. I tell my students this every year. I'll tell it to you. If you grow up and have kids and you name one of your kids Ithamar and bring me the birth certificate, I will give you $100. If you prove to me that you named your kid Ithamar. Better yet, if the first name is Ithamar and the middle name is Beard, I'll give you $200. That's a promise. It's a guarantee. Ithamar Beard Bristol, or whatever your last name is. Wonderful name. Anyway, here's another description of the New York City slums. And the slums are basically just these kind of like pretty brutal, poverty-stricken areas that most working class people in the cities live in. So this is a description of what somebody saw who went into that area that was from the middle class. Just pay attention to these words, man. Like this is a brutal assembly of words put into one sentence to describe something, right? Gaunt, shivering people with ghastly faces, living among hideous squalor and deadly effluvia, the dim, undrained courts oozing with pollution, the dark, narrow stairways decayed with age, reeking with filth, overrun with vermin. Dang, man. Imagine if you had like a friend over, it's the first time you had him at your house, and then you were like, "Hey man, what do you think of my house?" And he used any of these words to describe it, right? Hideous, squalor, deadly, dim, oozing, pollution, decayed, filth, vermin. Any of those words would offend you to describe your home, let alone all of them packed into one dang sentence. So this is the reality, the very sad, brutal reality that more and more people find themselves living in, a majority of people living in the North. So we are really finding ourselves in a different place than we did a couple of decades ago when the North had a lot more, like I say, didn't have all this industrialization going on and had a lot more sense of kind of community and people looking out for one another, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the three classes, right? But let's focus a little more on this poor class, this poor working class for a moment. Let's remind ourselves, last chapter, we learned about something called the Second Great Awakening. And in the Second Great Awakening, it was a religious revival movement, right? And we talked about how people were inspired during that revival movement to want to do good for other people, because there was this belief that you get to control your own spiritual destiny, that if you do good things, right? What was the Sunday school thing? If I am good, God will love me and make me happy. If you do good things, I don't know if you remember that slide, but the guy holding the umbrella over the head of the lady in the wheelchair where he was getting soaked. If you do good things, leave a big tip, hold the door open for somebody, help somebody when they drop a bunch of stuff in the middle of the hallway when they're walking down the hall. If you do good things, God will love you and God will count that, and it'll help you in your position to try to get into the good place instead of the hot place, right? So this is the ideology that's coming out of the Second Great Awakening. Now, the timing here, in case you're not able to put this all together, that's fine, I'll do it for you. That's why they pay me tons of money, is that the Second Great Awakening happened in the 1820s and 1830s. The Industrial Revolution is happening in the 1820s, 1830s. We're starting to see the full impacts of industrialization in the 1840s. All of these realities that we just talked about on the last slide of how harsh things are for the poor working class are becoming abundantly obvious to more and more people during this time period. And that's happening right at the same time that you have this entire group of people from the middle class, mostly middle class women, who were inspired by the Second Great Awakening to want to go and help people. So this creates something that is known as the Benevolent Empire. It says here, alarmed by the deteriorating conditions of the cities caused by poverty, religious leaders targeted drunkenness, adultery, prostitution, and crime, and a variety of other things. Here's a whole bunch of new societies that were founded during this time period: the Prison Discipline Society, the American Society for Promotion of Temperance, the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows and Small Children, the Orphan Asylum Society, the Society for the Promotion of Industry, and the General Union for the Promotion of the Observance of the Christian Sabbath. So there's a few things to point out here. Number one, yes, there is almost an army of middle-class women who are going into these poor neighborhoods and creating organizations that are meant to help, right? I'm not trying to do some sort of a, religious class here, but this and I would be the wrong person for it anyway, but this passage right here speaks directly to what this whole benevolent empire is about. Matthew 25 verses 35 through 36. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you imprisoned me. I was in prison and you came to me. This is Jesus talking to his followers and saying, hey man, like when you help people who are hungry, people who are thirsty, people who are a stranger or an immigrant, people who are poor and don't have clothes, people who are sick, people in prison, when you help those people, you are helping me as whatever, blah, 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 blah. And that again is, then God will be happy about that. So people are inspired to do these things. But it should be noted, it's an important note about the benevolent empire. All of the things the benevolent empire does focus on helping you be better, right? Because we're still in this ideology that if you are one of the people living in the working class and the lower class, that you are suffering, you are struggling, it's probably something wrong with you, not something wrong with society. So none of the things that are going to go on during this whole benevolent empire are like, maybe we should pay people more money, or maybe we should make working conditions safer in factories, or maybe we should, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing about changing the system that was hurting people or putting people in these bad positions. It was still under this assumption of, if you are poor, it's probably something that you've done wrong. So here, let me come and help you. It's very paternalistic, a little insulting, but they're in their heart is in the right place. It's just not, it's not really going to solve the problem, right? The more you try to help people because you assume that there's something wrong with them and ignore the larger issue, right? it's kind of like, well, never mind. I don't want to use that analogy if we're not in the classroom. This is being recorded. So anyway, so that's kind of what's going on here with the Benevolent Empire, right? It's this Second Great Awakening inspired movement of all of these kind of organizations being created, and middle class women coming in to try to help people who are struggling. But again, it's all focused on helping you be better, not changing the system that's causing you to be in this position. Right? Huge focus on alcoholism, by the way. This thing is this painting or whatever art is known as like the 10 steps of an alcoholic. And you could say he goes from drinking, having a good time and everything going all right, and he gets into a little bit of fight, and he gets out of control, so on and so forth, and eventually he kills himself. Because I guess that's what you do if you drink too much money and now or drink too much alcohol. Now his wife and his child are left all alone. So there's this hard core. I mean, that's an intense anti-alcohol message, right? If you drink too much alcohol, you will kill yourself. Your wife and children will be left alone. But there's a hardcore anti-alcohol movement going on as part of this Benevolent Empire. Okay, I think we have one more thing to talk about. Okay, 2 slides for one more thing. Okay, another thing that we need to think about, or another thing that we need to be aware of during this time period is, as we industrialize, that is going to attract a lot of immigrants, right? So there's going to be a kind of huge burst in immigration during industrialization. 2 things that generally are true, and one I mentioned earlier about anytime we industrialize. One, it'll create an opportunity for a lot more women to go from the private sphere to the public sphere, but it also creates kind of a huge attraction for immigrants to come to our country because it's jobs, 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 jobs. So the 2 main places where people are going to be immigrating from, oh, wait, that's the next slide. Let's just get to the numbers right here. Okay. So by 1860, right? So we're comparing 1789 when the Constitution was ratified to 1860. So this is a 71-year swing, right? So in a 71-year period from when the Constitution was ratified in 1789 to when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, we go from having 4 million people in the United States to having 31 million people in the United States. That's a huge population burst. We went from having 13 states to 33 states, right? We become the 4th most populous state in the West. That means if you count all of the Western Hemisphere and all of Europe, that we have the 4th highest population, right? And we're only 71 years old if you count from when the Constitution was ratified. The number of cities that have more than 20,000 people living in them went from 2 in 1789 to 43 in 1860. So we are also urbanizing. We talked about that a little bit too. And this population is happening as a result of a rising birth rate and immigration. In the 1700s, we said the population of the United States was doubling every 25 years. In 1860, the population of the United States is still doubling every 25 years. And I ran this one by you before, but imagine if we were in a classroom and there was no pandemic and there's 35 of us, and I said every 25 minutes in a 100-minute period, the population of this class will double. So 25 minutes in, we'll go from 35 to 70. Another 25 minutes later, go from 70 to 140. Another 25 minutes later, we'll go from 140 to 280. Holy smokes, it's going to get crowded, right? And that's what's happening. So take a look at the number of immigrants coming to the United States by decade. In the 1820s, about 130,000 immigrants came to the United States. In the 1830s, the number jumps up pretty significantly, more than doubles to 540,000. In the 1840s, the number is going to jump up again very significantly, again, more than doubling to 1.4 million. In the 1850s, it's going to double to 2.8 million. So in the 1820s, we had 130,000 immigrants. In the 1850s, just 30 years down the road, 2.8 million immigrants coming to the United States. So yes, immigration is a huge part of this time period because people are being drawn in large part by all of this factory work. The 2 places where most of these immigrants are coming from are Ireland and Germany. So let's talk about each of those real quick. In the 1840s and 50s, 1.7 million Irish immigrated to the United States. During that same time period, about 1.4 million Germans immigrated to the United States. And it's important to differentiate these 2 groups, okay? The Irish are coming here for economic reasons. They're fleeing Ireland because things are really bad there. Their economy is in really bad shape. There's a whole, I think this is when the potato famine was. I don't know. You guys can correct me on that one. But they are coming here for work. So most Irish people are coming to cities because that's where the work is. They're coming to the cities and they're applying for jobs at the factories and so on and so forth. And as a result, there will be a very strong anti-Irish sentiment. Just like today, there's a very strong, in our country, I'd say really over the past 30 or 40 years, there's kind of been like a strong Latino immigrant sentiment in our United States, in our country, right? I would argue undeservedly, but it's a reality of our country today. That was focused on the Irish during that time period. And the reality is that we've gone through many stages in our country where there's been a strong anti-immigrant sentiment. It kind of changes who we're mad at, but it's kind of this one of just kind of the dark streaks of American history and American kind of society, is this kind of anti-other, anti-immigrant mentality. And in this case, it was the Irish, because the Irish were coming to the cities and they're applying for jobs, and we didn't like that they were coming to steal our jobs. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, then yeah, it should. That's kind of the common refrain of like, we don't want the immigrants here, they're going to come here and steal all of our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So the Irish are trying to come here and they're moving to the cities, and there's a very strong anti-Irish sentiment as a result. Germans, on the other hand, are actually coming here more for political reasons. There's kind of political instability in Germany at the time. And most of the Germans who come here come relatively economically stable. So they're not really like, oh man, I got to get a job, I'm desperate. So a lot of the Germans move out to like the Great States Lakes, like places like Illinois and places like Wisconsin and so on and so forth. And they buy land and they farm. So there's not really this strong anti-German sentiment, because they just show up and then go out and they farm and they grow food and they don't really bother anybody. So even there's a lot of Germans coming in at the same time, there's a lot of Irish, there's a lot of anti-Irish sentiment. There's not a lot of anti-German sentiment because of how they're coming and what they're doing. The Germans are going out and buying land and doing agriculture. The Irish are showing up and competing against other people for jobs in factories and moving into these areas where there's a lot of things are getting more densely populated and they're overcrowded, et cetera, et cetera. So this anti-immigrant sentiment that I was just alluding to is known as nativism. Nativism is the term for anti-immigrant sentiment. And like I said, it is something that basically exists throughout our history. I mean, you saw the Alien and Naturalization Act by the Federalists in the 1790s. You see this very strong anti-Irish immigrant sentiment coming about in the 1840s. We will see another wave of anti-immigrant sentiment coming that will come about in the 1890s, also in the 1800s, a lot of anti-Chinese immigrant on the West Coast. It's just something that every once in a while kind of rears its ugly head. And I would argue that we are right now in this distinct moment going through one of the most kind of aggressive anti-immigrant moments we've ever had in our country's history, which again, I would argue is incredibly unfortunate and doesn't help our country at all. But it is something that we've struggled with periodically throughout our nation's history. Certainly we did in the 1840s and at various other times. Okay, so that puts a bow on chapter 9. That's part 3. Hopefully you're able to fast forward through that or do that at 1.25 speed or something. But so these huge economic changes, industrial revolution, market revolution, transportation revolution, is changing our country. That's why we call them revolutions. It's fundamentally changing our country in a lot of ways. Where people live, where people work, how people are connected to other people through their economic lives, right? How much control people have over their own economic lives. The West emerging as a region that is actually kind of economically stable and sustainable and contributing to our society overall. The kind of class structure in society in the Northeast, huge waves of immigrants coming in, strong anti-immigrant sentiment as a reaction to those immigrants coming in. So yeah, lots of stuff going on during this time period, because anytime you see this kind of huge shift in society, there's this huge just shift. We were this way and now we're this way, there's this big change. It destabilizes a lot of things and brings a lot of kind of animosity and frustration. So, whether it's unions forming and workers resenting their bosses, or whether it's immigrants coming in and people resenting those immigrants, there's a lot of things that are being disrupted in our society as a result of these economic shifts, because it is a revolution. And again, the large takeaway is that For our country, for our nation, our economy is stronger because of industrialization. We're producing more efficiently, we're producing more, we're becoming actual kind of like manufacturing. We have a sector of our economy that's manufacturing based. That's a strong part of our economy. That's all good. There's a lot of stuff happening below the surface that's becoming destabilized that we're going to need to confront and face as we move forward. So that's it. I'm done. See you later. Thanks for showing up. Have a good day.